Hello everybody, it's a pleasure to be here to introduce the panel, which today has one change, which is just that Lauren Bonn, whose name appears, won't actually be making it to the UK today. She'll be attending tomorrow. She's an artist, an activist who's been a strong supporter of the project since its inception. Instead, we have the pleasure of hearing Marina later, so my job will be to get everyone to speak, but not too much. And I'm not going to give you their full biographies because you have those already, but just to say that my thinking when looking at these biographies is that to continue with a theme which has run throughout the workshops, there's this idea, this word that we picked up on of rawi, which is the idea of this, comes the Arabic word, which is to do with a story and a source, the fact that you've got the root of this word is very similar. So I'm going to be taking the themes of water and the flow of ideas from source onwards in terms of structuring it so that we have Ben Rawlence first, who spent a lot of time in the refugee camps in Africa. He's written 2 books, Radio Congo and City of Thorns. He's also worked as an activist with Human Rights Watch, and he can talk, if he so wishes, about his experience in the refugee camps, and then moving on to David Herd, who's got experience here with Refugee Tales, a professor of modern literature, the School of English at the University of Kent. There seemed to be a strange coincidence that there was a Black Mountain theme running with both these men, one who lives in a Black Mountain in Wales and the other who is inspired by the poets of Black Mountain. I don't know how that happened, but it did. So these 2 men will start, Ben then moving on to David, and we have the honor of hearing Marina at the end, at our inspiration to us all, who I was lucky to hear the other night at a presentation on the Sheikh Zayed Award, and all the speakers were very good, but it was something about hearing Marina that got everybody around me so excited. Some of them had never heard her before, and I thought, what is it, this thing that Marina has that inspires so much? And it seems to me that it's almost an ability to treat people and ideas and objects with the intensity of somebody deeply in love. It's like not just an analysis of detail, but it's also the compassionate desire to make sense and to smooth over. That anyway, everyone was very excited by her, so she will be having the last session today. So I'm going to hand over to Ben first. You've got 25 minutes and I'm going to please you.
Tell me to shut up when I need to shut up. Okay. Shall I try and stand? I'll try and stand. I can see more of you at the back. I might not be able to read my notes. Is that working? Do I need it? Should I put it down? It's for the camera. Okay. It's not working. It's working for you. Okay, good. Yeah, it's like the mace, the storytelling mace. Here we are. So, this is my first introduction to all of you. I had a very brief chat with Marina a few months ago, and I was excited to hear what was going on. I've been to Sicily at the beginning of my career, working as a human rights activist about 10 years ago, and was devastated. And it was part of what sent me back to Africa to keep working on these issues at the other end, if you like, of that particular journey. The reason Marina and I came into contact was because of my recent book, City of Thorns, which is about one of the world's largest refugee camps. It was the world's biggest for a little while. 300,000 people living in the middle of the desert in northern Kenya. It's called Dadaab, and the book is called City of Thorns. What that book tries to do is to take you to the camp and to show you through the eyes of the people who live there what life is like there. So I'd like to say a couple of things rooted in that experience, but spurred by the ideas of Hannah Arendt, because the title of this panel was Stories as Action. And that's, if going back to Hannah Arendt, as I have done recently for another conference, made me think in many different ways about how that experience maps to Hannah's theories and how it might apply to what we're trying to do here. But firstly, a funny story about the title, Stories in Transit. there's a part of Dadaab refugee camp called transit. And it might seem odd that within a refugee camp you have another section called transit. But transit is a special place where people go who are waiting to leave the camp. Because although this is supposed to be a temporary thing, Dadaab has been there now for 27 years. You've got 3 generations of people born and raised in this camp. And the bizarre thing is that even this temporary area called transit, which is where people are awaiting resettlement usually to Europe or the United States, has also become a kind of permanent place. And if you're a journalist seeking stories in Dadaab, you go to transit because all the good stories are in transit. That's where people, both the stories within transit, what happens within transit, this sort of secluded special zone for people who have special difficulties or who are at risk in the camp, but also the stories that happen within it. So, for example, if you chance upon my book at some point, there is a love story there between Monday and Muna. Muna, a young Somali woman who grew up in the camp and who wants to rebel against the clan, and Monday, who is a lost boy from Sudan, who was a child soldier, who falls in love with her. And they have this incredible Romeo and Juliet relationship, which centers on transit and them being attacked for their love and eventually escaping the camp from this place. But it spoke to me, the title of this workshop spoke to me because precisely that. You have these stories going on within transit, within this space, and what I'm interested in is how these spaces connect. So I want to talk a bit about Hannah Arendt and a bit about my sort of political concerns here, which is with channels and with spaces. The spaces within transit, or the refugee camp more widely, and then the wider public sphere, how those spaces talk to each other and what the channels are between them. Because as Marina started talking about how stories are constituted, Hannah Arendt was very clear that nobody is the author of their own story, that the act of telling is constitutive of both the teller and the subject of the story. And crucially, that identity is revealed in the telling of the story, but also reconstituted at the same time. And what that means is that essence, the essence of who you are, and the perception of who you are contingent. They're dynamic, which creates political possibilities, and which is a direct rebuke to the fascists and the essentialists who say, no, we are one thing. But all of this depends, and this is the crucial thing with Hannah Arendt's insight, was it depends on the public sphere, what she called the space of public appearance. The value and the potential of story, I think, is uncontested, and I think we would all agree with that, but the space, the sphere, is the thing. Because it only has meaning, it only has relevance, it only has political potential within that space. So a couple more insights from the Dadaab camp. If you go to Dadaab and you ask to see drama, or you ask to see poetry, you probably won't find any. It's a city of 300,000 people, the size of Bristol, but there's very little cultural life going on. There's very little internal life. That's also true. I mean, it's there, but you don't see it. It's not shared because there are none of these public spaces. The cultural calendar in Dadaab is set by the United Nations. So the things that are celebrated are Global Hand Washing Day, International Non-Violence Against Women Day. I think my favorite was Global Toilet Day. These are the things that the 3 generations now growing up in the camp have understood as the cultural calendar. That's what they celebrate. International Refugee Day is, of course, the pinnacle, June the 20th, every year. So when there is a drama, it is a drama commissioned by an NGO, usually with a didactic purpose, to celebrate one of these Millennium Development Goals or otherwise humanitarian goals. And bizarrely, all of the musical instruments that are used in these dramas are locked up in the cupboard of Care International, and they're only unlocked on the days when they're needed for these celebrations. So there is this incredible kind of humanitarian hegemony, if you like, this sort of mechanistic approach to culture, where its only role is to transmit developmental and humanitarian ideals. It's not something that's freely accessible or encouraged for the refugees themselves. So therefore, you have hardly any music. You have silent weddings in the camp. And of course, everybody's very poor. You can't work in the camp, just like you can't work in the UK if you're an asylum seeker. You can't work. Nobody has any money. The singers are not paid. And the singers are, generally sometimes do sing out of pure love of singing, but often they're feeding their children or they're having to collect firewood or whatever to make a living. So they're not practicing their craft in the way that they used to. So there's no neutral space. Everything is owned or controlled by the NGOs, by the UN. And of course, they have their hearts in the right place, but their agenda is very skewed. And even the political space, you have elections in the camp. In fact, the freest elections I've ever witnessed in Africa, which is great. But rather like under British colonialism, you had these legislative councils that advised the authoritarian government. It's the same. You have a sort of UN administration and the refugees advise them. So it's not an independent political space where people can decide their priorities. It's an advisory capacity, and therefore it's not, again, a free, neutral space for the expression of people's own ideas. And this is quite important. One of the most heartbreaking documents I came across during the research for this book was a long letter from youth who were employed as incentive workers by the agencies. So, to explain, the UN nobody's allowed to work in Kenya. The Kenyan government doesn't allow it. No refugees are allowed to work in Kenya. But the UN tried to get around this by offering internships, what they called incentive positions. So as a refugee, I can work for Oxfam or whoever and get experience which hopefully will stand me in good stead in the future when I leave the camp, which of course never happens. These incentive workers are not allowed to be paid commensurate with Kenyan workers, so they get the equivalent of $1.50 or $2 a day, which they considered to be unfair. And these youth had written a letter referencing International Labour Organization standards on slavery and so on, and putting a very eloquent case as to why they felt that they were being oppressed. Those youth sent their letter off. That letter never appeared anywhere. They never had an opportunity to discuss that in any kind of open forum. And when I talked to them, this was 2 or 3 years later, they were still left wondering, do these international standards exist? Is our experience true? They needed their experience validated because their very small sphere of truth, which was basically their own hut that they had built next to a football pitch, which was their space, was not connected to any other space, whether in the refugee camp or whether more widely. So when that letter was footnoted in my book, they were delighted. There was this feeling, and this, I'll get onto this if I've got time. How am I going? That, of course, me, a white man coming and writing the story of this camp very far away from my own home, what right did I have, and so on. But the refugees themselves felt delighted that here was a book that spoke to their experience where they felt, yes, it is true, my experience is true. It has been written about, published, it's written down. Therefore, I can point and say, yes, this is my experience. And therefore, suddenly that injustice appears all the more grave. And suddenly people start paying attention. Whereas it hadn't had that traction before. So the question of the spheres and the question of the space within which the stories are told gets to the crucial part of Hannah Arendt's theory of stories as action, which is the polis. So the stories are all well and good, but it's that community of memory. It's the frame, the reference that the stories reflect. And I mean, this is part of what journalists like me who write narrative nonfiction are trying to do, is to trying to appeal to one frame of reference, trying to drag one experience into another frame of reference, what reviewers call humanizing refugee stories or humanizing the stories of the marginalized. You're trying to make this connection between this sphere and that sphere. And And it's that community of memory which is so vital, and which is both missing within the camps and missing in the relationship of the camps to other spheres and other publics. 2 examples. Selma mentioned I've written 2 books, one about Congo and one about this camp in Kenya. In Congo, I traveled around the war zone in the east of the country, and I went to many IDP camps, which internally displaced persons camps, where you had a village that had sort of shifted 10 miles or 20 miles because of the war. And there was pretty much no UN presence, hardly any aid. These people organized themselves into their own communities. When I showed up, and they overcame their surprise at a white man arriving on foot in the middle of Congo, and they said, "What are you doing here?" And I tried to explain in Swahili and French that I want to hear your stories. They said, "Oh, right, okay, no problem. Sit down." And the whole community gathered, all of them, to make sure that I was being told the correct story, and the story flowed. And it was a sort of symphonic version of a story, with everybody chipping in and everybody reaffirming that, yes, this was the experience of our community and our camp. When I did a similar experience, tried to do similar research in the camp, but also in the slums in Nairobi, you don't have that at all. People want to talk in secret, away from others. They want to tell you their story alone. They don't want other people to come and listen because it's so contested, because there isn't a shared community in those places, in those experiences. There isn't a shared narrative of a refugee experience, really, in Dadaab. And the same in the slums in Nairobi. You have this very disorganized group of people who are very confused. There are all sorts of reasons for that, but I think it's instructive in terms of how the stories are being told and remembered. So back to me as the paternalistic white man in the refugee camp, telling the stories of these people. I was criticized most heavily in Nairobi by Kenyans, black African Kenyans, not the Somali Kenyans who share an ethnicity with the Somalis across the border, saying, "Who are you? Why should you go and tell the story of this camp?" And one of the refugees from the camp was there in the audience, and he stood up and said, "Look at all you Kenyan journalists. It's 5 hours on the road, up the road by bus. You could have gone and written that book, but you didn't. You stayed here." So they felt very strongly that this was valid work, that I was, again, they didn't feel that there was any problem with somebody else being the author of their story. The most important thing was that it was true. And the important thing here is not that, I was doing a worthy thing, but actually there were plenty of refugee journalists too, that no Kenyan TV networks or newspapers had ever chosen to engage. Now, thankfully, that's changing, because one of the things I did was start a project bringing those voices down to Nairobi. But I did several workshops up in the camp with young refugee journalists who had great stories about this camp, because you can imagine, 300,000 people, quite lawless, close to the border with Somalia, Al-Shabaab, smuggling, all sorts of interesting stories that anybody should be interested in, from the New Yorker to the Guardian to the BBC, let alone the newspapers in Nairobi. But those journalists up there, these trainee journalists, young men and women in their teens and 20s who were looking to me for experience, said, "We've got all these stories, but nobody wants to run them." And what they meant was that Dadaab FM, run by the UN, and Internews, run by the UN, paid for by the European Union, would not run any of their stories because they were critical or they were political. What they wanted, again, was the development stories about water coming to Block H down at the end of the camp, and wasn't this a great thing? And they wanted a particular frame, a particular kind of a story that spoke to a particular frame. So what I tried to do was connect these kids to Voice of America, to the BBC, and so on. And still, there is that problem of frame with the mainstream media, but less so. But what they really needed, and what they're hopefully going to be working on, is their own channels, their own YouTube channel, their own Facebook page, their own blog. So this connection of the spaces, we need to talk about the spaces, but we also need to talk about these Venn diagrams, if you like, the way these spheres intersect. So the last point, am I right for time? Okay, good. So what I was trying to do with this book was trying to make this refugee camp visible, was trying to validate the experience of my friends there, but also to make it visible, to bring this, to enlarge the sphere, if you like, to bring this, the experience of this place to a wider audience. But that was naive, that was a nice idea, but visibility in itself is not enough. And what I'm interested in as an activist, and as a citizen, as a human being, really is the potential for political change and the potential for empowerment. And what does empowerment, I asked myself this question in relation to Dabbagh, what does empowerment mean in the context of that refugee camp? And I mean, the enduring principles are there. There's a lot of theory about, political theory about how that happens. But to return to Hannah Arendt, she talks about the polis and the telling of stories within a space as being the foundation of the polis. And just to quote a sentence from Human Condition, the polis, properly speaking, is not the city-state in its physical location, it's the organization of the people as it arises out of acting and speaking together. And its true space lies between people living together for this purpose, no matter where they happen to be. And in an age of the internet, that's a really exciting proposition. During totalitarianism, you had her idea of alternative spaces, alternative spheres where truth would hopefully spill over into other spaces, into the mainstream. And when we've got such a commodified mainstream media, not just mainstream, but let's call it sort of public attention broadly writ with social media, attention has become commodified, mercantilized, if such a word exists. But attention itself has become commodified, which means that what you're trying to talk about is immediately reduced to content. And that is not genuine communication. So talking about what I'm interested in is how to create spaces for communication and then how to create channels between them so that the truths in one space can spill over into truths in another space. Because Europe has big problems. And I think a big part of what this project is about is, yes, telling stories for the purpose, for the empowerment, for the edification, and for the pleasure of the people who are in Sicily and elsewhere, but very much also to hopefully allow some of those truths to spill over into the rest of society, because, back to the beginning, nobody is the author of their own story. So our stories are constituted by those experiences just as much as their experiences, with perhaps slightly more power imbalance than the other way, are being constituted by the stories that we tell about them. So the stories both ways need to have air to breathe and need to have connections between them. So the original conversation I had with Marina and some of her team was about live streaming events or a YouTube channel for people in refugee camps to communicate their own experiences, or blog spaces, blank pages, open spaces, places where they can communicate. Because there are plenty of people, I've had a flood of emails from people about my book saying, how can we get in touch with Dabbagh? How can we help? How can we do things? People wanting to spend thousands of dollars volunteering there. So just, hold on. Actually, the best thing you can do is just talk to these people. And they have their own groups now. There are these Facebook groups for kids in the camp. And they're desperate to connect. They want to apply for international competitions, to have their journalism, their stories placed places, to see them in print. They want all of those connections, but it's not really happening yet. But I think this group represents perhaps a chance for some of that to happen, for a bit more connection for people to come together. I think that's everything I wanted to say. Hopefully, there we are. Thanks.